So before we can really talk about environmental biology, it's important to understand why do we have this field in the first place? What is the point of environmental biology? What is the point of all these laws and regulations and treaties and agreements around the world? And the very simple answer is to protect biodiversity. But what is biodiversity? And maybe even more importantly, why do we even care about biodiversity? What does it do for us? So this lecture is going to take a look at what biodiversity is and what we mean by that. And then the next video lecture series is going to talk about why does it matter and what do we as humans get from it. So very easy to break down the word biodiversity. Bio, again, meaning life. We've seen that quite a few times now. And then diversity, you have heard of this word a ton of times, but simply just looking at the variety. So biodiversity is really just looking at the variety of life. But we've recently learned that life is a pretty big word, and life encapsulates a lot of different things. Are we talking about an organism, a population, an ecosystem, the world? What variety? Variety at which level? And similar to biology, we can categorize biodiversity at different levels as well. Now I'm going to talk about these more in depth in just a moment, but just as an overall view, we have genetic biodiversity, so looking at the genes in the population. We have species diversity. This is probably what you likely think of when you think of biodiversity. And then we have ecosystem biodiversity. We explored different ecosystems a little bit earlier, thinking about deserts and the frozen tundra and tropical rainforests. So biodiversity can really refer to any of these levels, and depending on what we're trying to protect, depending on what resources we have, will really dictate which level we're protecting. So let's start with the lowest level and look at genetic biodiversity. So simply, genetic biodiversity is just what is the variety of the genes or the DNA in a population. Remember, a population is a group of organisms of the same species. And when we're saying variety of the genetic material, it's not, oh, does it have longer DNA than this one? But more so, looking at the DNA and looking at the genes an organism has, how is it different? Thinking about humans, our DNA is what dictates our different eye colors and skin colors and height and all sorts of different traits that we have. If we look at this picture, and I'm going to use this picture a little bit as an example, these are rock pocket mice. Just know that they're mice, and they have different fur color, similar to humans with different skin color. We have darker fur, we have lighter fur. Now, the reason we care about genetic biodiversity is because the more diversity a population has, the more likely it will survive. If there's a big storm, if there's a new disease, if there is some environmental change, the more diversity that exists, the greater the likelihood that population survives. Yes, some individuals may still die, but as a species, the species is surviving. It is not going extinct. So let's use these mice as an example. If we look at the background of where these mice are, we see kind of two different types of background. The black is volcanic rock, and then the tan color is showing sand. And so this is likely a basal volcanic rock environment, and that the sand has just been the consequence of weathering of rocks, and maybe it was sand blown over from a desert or something nearby. So let's just talk about the example. So let's imagine that if we take this environment and there is higher than normal winds, maybe for weeks on end. And what happens is a lot of that sand gets blown away. Now below that sand is more of this black volcanic rock. So look at these mice populations. There's going to be some that have lighter fur color and some that have darker fur color. And which one do you think is going to survive? Probably the one that can blend in more. Predators have a harder time finding them. Owls can't really see them. Snakes can't really see them. And other things just can't really see the darker colored mice because it blends in with the background. So they're more likely to survive. However, the lighter colored mice stick out really easily. They're probably the first ones to get picked off and eaten because it was so easy to find them. So yeah, sucks for those lighter furred guys, but the population as a whole survived. Imagine if there was no genetic diversity. Imagine all of the mice were this lightly colored mouse. Well, that means that if we have this sandstorm and it blows away all this sand and there's only black volcanic rock around, that population will likely go extinct. They don't blend in. They stick out like a sore thumb. So it's going to be a lot harder for that population to survive. Now, this is like a simple graphic. You may not really care about these mice, so let me bring it a little bit closer to home. I say closer to home thinking about humans, but we're actually jumping over to Ireland and jumping there in the 1800s. You may have heard of the Great Famine or the potato blight before in Ireland, but maybe you don't quite know why that happened. Potato blight in and of itself just means a disease. We usually use the word blight when we're referring to plants. So how did this Great Famine happen? Well, it started with potatoes and it started with a disease. So if we look here in this diagram, on the left-hand side, this is your typical Irish farmer growing potatoes. And in agriculture, it's actually pretty common to use clones of the same potato or corn or wheat. You know that potato grows really well, doesn't need a lot of water, it just needs to be cold, very little nutrients, etc. You found the perfect potato. And so what farmers do is they can clone it. A couple ways of doing this, and it's usually not even farmers, it's researchers in labs. Point being, it is very common practice that you've got one type of potato, it is literally twin brothers with the potato next to it in your entire field. Unfortunately, though, this leaves that population of potatoes, open for bad things to happen. So what happened is that it likely started in one field and likely with one potato that got some sort of disease. Maybe it was something that was in the soil, maybe it was passed on by an insect, and it got sick. Plants get sick just like humans get sick. The unfortunate thing, though, is that because every single potato is a clone of one another, that means what gets one potato sick, it's going to get another potato sick, and another, and another, and the rest of that field. But farmers all over Ireland were using the same exact clone of the same exact potato. So if one gets sick, they all get sick. Think of it in the classroom. You know, we are not twins of one another. If one of us gets sick, it is very likely the rest of us do not get sick. Each of us have our own tolerances to disease. Some of us get sick more than others. Some of us may have already been exposed to something that makes us immune. There's a lot of variety in our immune systems. But when we use the same exact potato, there wasn't a variety in immune systems. There wasn't variety in that genetic code. And so therefore, if one's susceptible, they're all susceptible. Now you may think, oh, well, it's just potatoes. Well, if you know anything about Ireland, that is one of their staple foods. That's like saying, hey, there's no more rice in China. There's no more rice in India. It's a big deal that pretty much their potato crop failed year after year after year. In the country of Ireland, about 1 million people starved, and by starved to death. And another 1 million people emigrated. They just left the country altogether to go somewhere where there was food. So this 2 million people who either died or left, that was a quarter of the population of Ireland. So not only are they hurting thinking about crops, but they're going to be hurting economically as well, losing such a big portion of their population. We've learned a little bit from this, not just in Ireland, but in other places around the world. We're a little bit more cognizant that this is a potential issue because we've seen it happen. And so instead of growing just one clone of a potato, we grow multiple types in the same field. So if you look at this second image, although it makes it look like there's different types of potatoes, it's still a white russet potato, but they're not all clones of one another. There's a variation in that population of potatoes, just like there's variation in the genetics between people in a classroom. And this isn't to say this is going to get rid of that blight, get rid of that disease. It's just if some get diseased, it doesn't kill the entire population. Some of these potatoes had just a natural immunity to that disease, and so that it survives. And if our food survives, we survive. So this is an example of where we lost genetic biodiversity, but it actually made a huge impact on the human population. There's other examples of these. If you ever want to look up bananas actually went through a very similar thing. And the bananas that you and I eat are actually different than the bananas that maybe our grandparents, even great-grandparents ate. Because the bananas all were wiped out. So it's a really interesting story. So that's all about genetic biodiversity. Incredibly important to preserve within populations to ensure the survival of populations.